There's an old story in church history about a man who was walking away. He was leaving a city, leaving people who depended on him, leaving the very thing that he once said yes to. Pressure had built, persecution was coming, and it felt easier to leave than to stay. So he walked. And as he walked down the road, he saw a man coming towards him. He stopped and asked him, "Where are you going?" The man replied, "I'm going into the city to do what you will not do." And in this moment, the man realized who it was. It was Jesus. And it was as if Jesus was saying, "If you will not obey what I have asked you to do, I will go myself." The man turned around and walked back into the city, and days later, he was killed for his faith. That man was Peter. What's interesting is this. Long before Peter was walking away from Rome, he was walking away from something else. And before we judge him, before we think, how could he do this? I see something of this in my own life. Right now, if I'm being honest, and at this moment, it's gotten a little bit better, but I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm a little frustrated. We have a newborn baby at the house, and for some reason when he was born, or this is our third child, I thought it would be like quiet or that it would be easier. But the reality is we have two other boys, we have three boys in total, and it's just loud and crazy and obnoxious all the time in my house. But for some reason I imagined silence, and you may be thinking like, you're crazy, like you have three boys, like no, it's chaos. But I kind of had this idea that we'd have another baby and everybody's so happy and like, oh, and they'd be quiet. But it's not the way it is. They run, they jump, they scream, they break things. That's just how boys are. And in the middle of all this chaos, knowing silence is basically impossible, that's all I crave. Stable, simple, calm, quiet. And here's what I've been realizing, I don't run from persecution like Peter did, but I do run from, stillness. I run from waiting. I run from quiet moments where I actually have to stop and listen. Like right now, it's impossible for me to stop and be quiet. But when I do have moments and opportunities to be calm and quiet, I don't want to do that either. So I'm in this limbo of I need to be quiet and still, but when I have opportunities to be quiet and still, I can't. Peter walked away from Rome because it felt overwhelming. I sometimes walk away from quiet because it feels inconvenient or uncomfortable. And that's where, John 21 begins to become really real to me. Because long before Peter was walking down a Roman road, he was standing on a beach. And Jesus had told him to wait, but instead of waiting, he went fishing. And that brings me to the famous story in the New Testament. After Jesus died and rose from the dead, he told his followers to wait for him, that he would give them further instructions. Peter, being Peter, the leader, the outspoken one, the one who couldn't sit still, decided he would go back to work while he waited. And if I'm honest, I understand that because waiting is hard. Stillness is hard. Listening is hard. Sometimes work feels more spiritual than waiting. Sometimes noise feels easier than quiet. Sometimes doing something feels better than sitting before the Lord and admitting, I don't know what to do unless you speak. But here is the truth. Many of us are not running from God. We are running from quiet, where we might actually hear him. In John 21, 1 through 25, we see this story unfold. Jesus had told his disciple to wait, but in John 21, 3, Peter says, I'm going fishing. And they all reply, we will go with you. They don't stop and pray. They don't ask for directions. They just do what feels natural. They go back to what they know, back to what feels familiar, they go back to fishing. But Jesus had already given them instructions in Acts 1:4. He told them, do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised. Wait. That was the instructions. Wait for the Spirit. But waiting is hard. As believers, I honestly think it's one of the hardest things that we are called to do. To sit, to pray, to not move, to not fix it, to not go back to what feels comfortable. Just wait for the Lord to speak. Peter was told to wait, but instead of waiting, instead of praying, he went fishing. And if I'm being honest, I see myself doing that a lot. And don't we all? How many times do we move without direction? How many times do we do what seems right before we even ask the Lord? Prayer is talking to God. But sometimes we forget it's also talking with God. When we speak, are we listening? Not just hearing. Listening really to what he is saying. Because in the Hebrew mindset, listening is not passive. To listen means to obey. If he speaks, I respond. If he directs, I follow. And if I'm honest, there have been moments in my life where I've heard him, but I didn't obey. And that's not really listening. Peter doesn't listen. And to make matters worse, he takes others with him. He says, I'm going fishing. And they say, we'll go with you. Do we realize something? When we do not take time to hear God, it doesn't just affect us. It affects the people around us. It affects the people following us, our wives, our children, our friends, our church. When we move without direction, others often move with us. So how does Jesus respond? And this is what I love. Jesus responds in almost the exact same way he first called Peter, on a boat, fishing after a long night of catching nothing. In John 21:6, Jesus says, throw your net on the right side of the boat. This is the right side. Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find something. And suddenly the net is full. It is almost identical to the first time Jesus calls Peter in Luke 5:4-6, when he said, put out into deep water and let down the net for a catch. And after they obeyed, they caught such a large number of fish that the nets began to break. What can we learn from Peter? First, Jesus will lovingly call us back to the thing he already said if we do not listen for the first time. And second, we must take time to listen. In the quiet, around the fire, by the lake, on the couch, in the early mornings, we must be still and listen. And I know it's hard. I've got 3 boys and it's chaos. But I know also that if I wake up just a little bit earlier, maybe I'll sacrifice and I'll put on the cartoons and just take a little bit extra time to be with Jesus. It's always possible to have 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes to be with the Lord in silence. But in the story, where was Jesus? Well, he was by the lake, not anxious, not striving, not panicking, just waiting and calling out to them. Where was Peter? Thinking about what he needed to do, how he needed to provide, how he needed to get moving. And I understand that. I know that pressure. But take it from me. The Lord has blessed us far more in following him than when I was trying to do it on my own. Like, even I look back at my life 10 years ago and I had nothing. And now today I feel like I have everything sometimes. Like, the Lord has been so faithful and so good. And I cannot take credit for pretty much any of it. I think it really was just waiting on him and trusting him in different seasons. And this just did not happen overnight. I've said this before, but waking up early to pray, even once a week, is where it happens. In the quiet, in the stillness, just being in his presence and waiting for him to show up. That is where some of the greatest blessings in my life have come from. And Peter knew this as well. He watched Jesus pray. He watched him go away into the quiet. But Peter struggled to do the same. Why? Because, well, it was just hard for Peter. It was hard for him to sit still. We can see that in the story of the Gospels. He was always the outspoken one, the let's do it kind of person. And sometimes it's hard for us. I remember moments in serving in YWAM that my favorite season was waking up at 5 a.m. And I did this for about 6 months. Waking up and just praying. I had a friend that used to do it with me, but he showed up very periodically. I was there and he was kind of there once or twice out of the 6 months. But it was some of the greatest intimacy that I've had with the Lord in those early mornings. And sometimes I'm 30 years old now, and that was like 10 years ago. And I really miss those moments. I crave those moments and I want to have those moments back. But with 3 kids, it's just hard. And one of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of Elijah on the mountain of God. Elijah had just finished confronting the prophets of Baal, but when Jezebel threatened him, he runs away and hides. This strong, powerful prophet suddenly becomes afraid. In 1 Kings 19:3, it says, he was afraid and arose and ran for his life. And then he does something we can all, I think, learn from. He talks to God, honestly, raw, vulnerable. He pours it out, and God responds, first with care, then with food, then with presence. And then Elijah journeys into the wilderness to the mountain of God just to hear God's voice. He journeys hundreds of miles just to hear God. There's wind, there's an earthquake, there's a fire. And Elijah stays. He waits. And after all of that, God speaks. And what does he say? Go back. Go all the way back to where you came from and do what I tell you to do. And I think that's incredible. Elijah went through the wilderness. He went through storms to hear God's voice. And sometimes we struggle to sit still for 20 minutes. Sometimes we want direction, but we do not want stillness or silence to get it. We want clarity, but we do not want quiet. We say we want God to speak, but we do not want to slow down enough to listen. And yet Jesus, he keeps inviting us into this place of hearing him. Back to the fire, back to the shore, back to the place of listening. In John 21, when Peter realizes it's Jesus, he jumps out of the boat, very charismatic Peter, and swims to the shore. And when he gets there, Jesus has already prepared bread and fish. Think about it. Jesus had already prepared food for them. It was ready. They didn't have to fish for anything. It is almost as if he is saying, you were out there trying to provide for yourself again when I had already prepared what you needed for today. When Jesus speaks, he provides. But the question is, are we listening? Then Jesus asks Peter 3 times, do you love me? And 3 times Peter says, yes. And 3 times Jesus says, feed my sheep. For every denial, restoration. For every failure, calling. Peter is not just forgiven, he is sent. And that question echoes in us. Do you love Jesus? Do you love him? Then feed what he cares about. Listen, obey, shepherd what I've placed in front of you. We all have a call, and the Lord has trusted us to feed and take care of the people around us, to be his representatives on the earth. This is where it becomes really personal, I think, for me. I remember in 2016 when I was on outreach in a community called Zapote. I wasn't really thinking about ministry. I wasn't thinking about being a pastor, but I remember so clearly that the Lord spoke to me. He said, Jacob, feed my sheep. And really, he did not want that. Throughout my time in Mexico, people kept telling me I should be a pastor, I should be a teacher, I should, preach the word of God. But I didn't really want that responsibility. I didn't want that weight. But it was the word that kept coming back to my heart and my mind. And it was not just people saying it. It was the Lord pressing it on my heart. And I noticed something else. The enemy was actually fighting that word. So if I said, I don't want to do that, he was totally okay with that, and like pushing people, saying that it's not a good idea. There were voices that discouraged me, voices that told me that I was not called, that I was not capable, it was not for me. And I wrestled with that. But once I stopped and, took a step into it, once I stopped resisting and started obeying, I realized it was exactly where the Lord really wanted me. He had been preparing me for this whole time. And Peter, he wrestled too. And I think all of us wrestle sometimes with what the Lord is speaking to us. The Lord told him to feed all his sheep, Jews and Gentiles, and Peter struggled with that. He had to be confronted. He had to grow. He had to listen, beyond his comfort. The calling is not always easy. Listening is not always easy. Obedience is rarely convenient, but it is always life-giving. And here is what I've learned. The Lord is speaking. He is always speaking. But the question is, are we listening? Not just hearing, but really listening and obeying to what he's saying. So here's what I want to invite us into this week. Not something dramatic, not a 40-day wilderness fast. We're not doing any of that, but just something simple. Pick one time this week, maybe early in the morning, maybe at night, 10 minutes, no phone, no distractions. Sit and say, Lord, I'm here. If you want to speak, I'm listening. Open the scriptures, read slowly, take your time. And you're not going to get it perfect. You're not going to always be able to do it. Something's going to come up. The kids are going to wake up. Something's going to catch on fire. You never know. Something is always going to try to get in that way, but try to be faithful. Keep those 10 minutes. Ask the Lord, what are you saying? What do you want from me today? What is the obedience that I can do today? And if something becomes clear, do it. Send a text to someone, make a call, forgive, apologize, encourage, serve. Listening without obedience is just spiritual noise. But listening with obedience changes everything. That is where Peter changed. That is where Elijah changes. That is where I changed. And where each and every one of us can change too, through listening to God and obeying his voice. The Lord is speaking. Let's be people to listen and obey. Because this cannot just be another sermon we hear and walk away from. This has to become a response. If the Lord has been trying to get your attention, stop running. If he has been asking you to wait, then wait. If he has been asking you to obey, then obey. If he has been asking you to return to him, then return to him. Do not go back fishing. Do not wait. Do what he has asked you. Do not run from the quiet because it feels uncomfortable. Do not keep calling it listening if you haven't already decided that you're going to obey. He's speaking. The question is, what are we doing about it? Lord, I just pray that you would speak now to each and every person here in this video, that we would have the radical obedience that Peter had going on the road, that Elijah had walking to the mountain. That we be people that pray and spend time in your presence, but then obey and bring your presence into the world around us. Amen. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and help us share this content so we can keep growing the kingdom of God here on the earth. Feel free to put a comment if you have questions or anything you would like to ask, or if you just want to continue to know more about the Lord. I'm always here and I'm always available to answer any questions or comments, or just if you need even some extra encouragement, I would love to be a part of that with you guys and help you guys walk on your journey. And the goal of this channel is that we would continue to bring people into intimacy, bring people to the tree of life, which is Jesus.